The sensor array at the far edge of the Orion Arm had been silent for 600 years. It floated in the cold dark between stars, doing what it was built to do, listening. It listened to the hum of distant pulsars, the crackle of dying suns, and the quiet breathing of empty space. It had never found anything worth reporting, until now. The signal was not clean. It was not elegant. It was a mess, a screaming, overlapping tangle of electromagnetic noise pouring out of a small yellow star system that nobody in the galactic Concord had ever bothered to visit. Radio waves, television broadcasts, satellite pings, military communications, and something that the array's processors could only describe as music, all crashed into each other in a storm of noise that stretched across every frequency the array could detect. The data packet arrived at Concord Central within the hour. Ambassador Zorath Vel was in his private chambers when his assistant brought the report. Zorath Vel was old, even by the long-lived standards of his insectoid species. He had brokered peace deals between civilizations that wanted to burn each other to ash. He had talked warships into standing down. He had spent 400 years learning that the galaxy was, for the most part, a quiet and predictable place. He read the report twice. Then he read it a third time. "How many languages?" he asked. "Over 6,000 confirmed," his assistant said. "Possibly more. The translation engines cannot keep up." Zorath Vel set the report down and stared at the wall for a very long time. In his entire career, he had never encountered a planet with more than 3 dominant languages. 6,000 was not a number that made sense. He ordered a diplomatic carrier fleet to the Sol system within the day. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond the orbit of the 8th planet. 12 ships, silver and smooth, arranged themselves in a standard observation formation and began scanning. High Observer Threndai stood on the observation deck of the lead vessel and watched the data pour in. Threndai was a reptilian creature, tall and thin, with eyes that had spent 3 centuries reading the records of newly discovered worlds. He had classified over 90 species in his career. He knew what to expect. He did not expect this. 9 billion life signs on a single planet, not spread thin across a few settlements, but packed into dense clusters that covered almost every landmass. The planet's orbit was cluttered with satellites, thousands of them, and the surface was scarred with the unmistakable marks of nuclear detonations. Old ones, but real ones. This species had built atomic weapons and had used them. On themselves. "They should be dead," Threndai said quietly. Commander Yurasone, who stood beside him on the observation deck, tilted her feline head and looked at the data again. "And yet they are not," she said. On Earth, the arrival did not go unnoticed. Every major space agency on the planet detected the fleet at almost the same moment. Telescopes in Chile, radar stations in Alaska, and a teenager with a homemade antenna in Oklahoma all saw the same thing. 12 objects that had not been there a moment ago, sitting perfectly still in the outer solar system. Within minutes, the news was everywhere. Television networks cut to emergency broadcasts. Social media collapsed under the weight of 1 billion simultaneous posts. People ran into the streets and looked up at the sky, even though there was nothing to see with the naked eye. Megan Price was sitting in her office at the United Nations headquarters in New York when her phone rang. She had been Secretary General for 8 months. Before that, she had been a lawyer in a small town in Ohio. She had taken the job because she believed in diplomacy and patience and the slow, careful work of bringing people together. She had not taken the job to negotiate with aliens. But the universe did not care what she had signed up for. Within 6 hours, she had assembled a team. Danny Holt was the first call. He was a retired Navy pilot who had spent the last 3 years working as a liaison between NASA and the Department of Defense. He was calm, sharp, and had a habit of making jokes when things got bad, which Megan suspected would be useful in the days ahead. Katie Warren was the second call. She was a linguist, the best in the country, some said the best in the world. And she had spent the last decade studying the structure of language itself, looking for the patterns that connected all human communication. She was stubborn, brilliant, and had once told a senator to his face that he was using the word literally wrong. The team was shuttled to a space station in low Earth orbit that had been hastily converted into a meeting point. It was cramped, it smelled like recycled air, and the coffee machine was broken. Danny looked around and said, "Well, this is exactly how I imagined first contact." The Concorde fleet did not approach. Instead, it began broadcasting a single message, a repeating sequence of mathematical pulses. Prime numbers, then geometric ratios, then something more complex. The message played on a loop, patient and steady, like a knock on a door. Katie Warren sat in front of a monitor with a notebook and a pencil. She listened to the message for 20 minutes. Then she started writing. She filled one page, then another, then another. The people around her watched in silence. She crossed things out, rewrote them, muttered to herself, and kept going. 53 minutes after the message first arrived, she put her pencil down and looked up. "It is a greeting," she said. "They are asking if we can understand them. And there is a framework here, a kind of basic grammar built into the math. I think it is a primer. They are trying to teach us how to talk to them." Danny leaned over her shoulder and looked at the pages of scribbled notes. "You got all that in under an hour?" Katie shrugged. "The math is elegant. Whoever designed this wanted it to be understood." Megan Price stood at the window of the station and looked out at the Earth below, blue and white, and turning slowly in the sunlight. Somewhere out past the edge of everything she had ever known, 12 alien ships were waiting for an answer. She turned to Katie. "Then let us answer them." Katie sat back down, picked up her pencil, and began composing humanity's first reply. It was short, simple, and built on the same mathematical framework the aliens had sent. When the transmission was broadcast from the station's antenna array, it carried a message that Katie had translated into the alien structure as faithfully as she could. It said, "We hear you. Yes, we speak." Across the black distance between them, aboard the Concorde flagship, Zorath Vel watched the reply appear on his screen. He read it once. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath through his mandibles. "Well," he said to no one in particular. "That was fast." Threndai, standing behind him, said nothing. He simply opened a new file in the assessment archive and typed 2 words at the top of the page. "Remarkable species." He did not yet know how right he was. The Galactic Concorde had a system for everything. When a new species was discovered, the process was always the same: observe, assess, and classify. Every known civilization in the galaxy had a tier ranking, from 1 to 7. Tier 1 meant the species was barely above animal intelligence. Tier 7 meant it had mastered faster-than-light travel and could be considered for full membership in the Concorde. Most newly contacted species fell somewhere between Tier 2 and Tier 4. In 400 years, no first-contact species had ever been ranked above Tier 3. Threndai took the assessment seriously. It was his life's work. He had a method, a formula, a way of looking at the numbers that stripped away emotion and left only facts. He believed in facts. He did not believe in surprises. Earth surprised him. Megan Price had made the decision early to be transparent. Some of her advisors had argued against it. They wanted to present a carefully edited version of human history, the good parts, the achievements, the moments of unity. Megan refused. "If we lie to them now," she said, "they will find out later. And then we will have lost the only thing that matters: trust." So they sent everything, all of it, the unfiltered, unedited history of the human race, translated as accurately as Katie Warren and her team could manage, was transmitted to the Concorde fleet in a single massive data package. Threndai began reading on the first day and did not stop for 3. He read about the wars first. There were so many of them. Wars over land, over religion, over resources, over ideas. Wars that killed thousands. Wars that killed millions. He read about weapons that can flatten entire cities in a single flash of light, and he learned that humans had built these weapons and then pointed them at each other for decades, living every single day under the possibility of total destruction. His hands trembled as he turned the pages. No species in his archive had ever done this. Any civilization that built weapons like that either used them and died, or never built them in the first place. Humans had built them, used them twice, and then simply continued existing. He read about slavery. He read about famine. He read about plagues that wiped out a third of a continent. He read about cruelty so casual and so widespread that it seemed woven into the fabric of the species itself. And then, slowly, he began to read the rest. He read about a doctor who spent his entire life fighting a disease that was killing children in places most people had never heard of. He read about firefighters who ran into collapsing buildings because someone inside might still be alive. He read about a woman who hid strangers in her attic for 2 years during a war, knowing that if she was caught, she would be killed. He read about scientists who worked for decades to cure diseases, musicians who made people weep with nothing but sound, and ordinary people who gave everything they had to help someone they would never meet. Friend-Eye sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. The data did not make sense. The numbers contradicted each other. Every chart he built showed 2 species living on the same planet, one that destroyed and one that healed, one that burned and one that built. But it was not 2 species, it was one. It was always one. Commander Yura Sohn had been reading the archives on her own. She had started with the military history, which was her area of expertise, but she had gotten lost somewhere in the section on human art. She could not stop looking at the paintings. There was one, a simple image of a night sky swirling with light, that she returned to again and again. She learned that the man who painted it had been suffering terribly when he made it. She could not understand how someone in that much pain could create something so beautiful. She found Danny Holt's file in the delegation records, and read it too. A military pilot who had flown combat missions, lost friends, and then retired to help build bridges between soldiers and scientists. The contradictions again. Always the contradictions. On the 4th day, Katie Warren and a small team were permitted to board the Concorde flagship for a face-to-face meeting. Danny Holt came with her as military advisor. Luke Beckett, a young Marine sergeant with broad shoulders and nervous eyes, came as security. They wore simple clothes. Megan had insisted on it. No uniforms, no flags, no symbols of power, just people. The diplomatic hall of the flagship was enormous. The ceiling stretched so high that it disappeared into shadow. Representatives from the assessment team lined the walls, insectoid, reptilian, crystalline, and others that the humans had no words for. Zorathvel stood at the center, tall and still, his compound eyes reflecting the light. Katie stepped forward. She opened her mouth and spoke in the galactic common tongue. It was not perfect. Her pronunciation was rough, and she paused in a few places to search for the right word. But the words were correct. The grammar was correct. The meaning was clear. She said, "Thank you for welcoming us. We have come with open hands and honest hearts. We hope to learn from you, as we hope you will learn from us." The hall went completely silent. Zorathvel did not move. Behind him, Friend-Eye checked his records with shaking hands. The galactic common tongue was a complex language built over centuries of interspecies diplomacy. It had taken most Concorde species an entire planetary cycle, roughly 1 Earth year, to decode it from the mathematical primer. The fastest recorded time was 140 days, achieved by a species that had 3 separate brain structures dedicated to language processing. Katie Warren had done it in 48 hours. Friend-Eye looked up from his screen. "That is not possible," he said. Katie, who had been briefed enough to understand the reaction, gave a small smile. "Your primer was well designed," she said in the common tongue. "The mathematical structure reminded me of Latin verb conjugations. Once I found the pattern, the rest followed." Danny, standing behind her, whispered, "Show off." Katie ignored him. Zorath Vel stepped forward and extended one of his long, segmented arms in a gesture of greeting. "In 400 years," he said slowly, "I have never been surprised by a new species. I am surprised now." The assessment took 2 more days. Threndai ran the numbers over and over, adjusting his models, checking his formulas, looking for an error. There was no error. When he filed his final report, his hand was steady, but his voice was not. Earth was classified as Tier 5. The announcement was broadcast across every communication relay in the Concord. Within hours, 800 civilizations knew that a species from an uncontacted world in the Outer Arm, a species that had never left its own solar system, had been ranked higher on first contact than any species in the recorded history of the galaxy. Zorath Vel sat alone in his chambers that evening, listening to one of the audio files from Earth's cultural archive. It was a piece of music, a single human voice accompanied by a simple instrument. He did not understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was the sound of someone who had known sadness and had chosen to sing anyway. He closed his eyes and listened until the song was over. On the observation deck, Ira Sohn stood at the viewport and looked at the small blue planet turning slowly below them. She had read the histories. She had seen the darkness, and she had seen what grew out of it: art, music, love, courage, and a stubbornness that bordered on madness. She whispered a single word in her own language. It did not translate well into the common tongue, but the closest meaning was something like unbreakable. She did not know it yet, but the galaxy was about to find out exactly how right she was. The news moved faster than light. Every communication relay in the Concord carried the same report. A newly discovered species from the Outer Arm, never before contacted, had been classified as Tier 5 on first assessment. The number was so far outside the normal range that most species assumed it was a data error. When they learned it was not, the galaxy did what galaxies do. It panicked, argued, and became deeply curious all at the same time. On the trading world of Kathamara, a collective of spacefaring merchants began planning a trade delegation before the official reports had even finished transmitting. They had built their fortunes on being the first to reach new markets, and a Tier 5 species meant technology, art, and resources that nobody else had seen. Within a day, they had filed 17 separate trade petitions with the Concord's Commerce Bureau. On the academic world of Shoal Prentice, scholars lined up for access to Earth's cultural transmissions. The linguistics department alone submitted 400 requests. One elderly professor, a being made mostly of light, who had spent 2 centuries studying the evolution of language, read Katie Warren's translation notes and wept. He said it was the most naturally gifted piece of linguistic work he had seen in his lifetime. And somewhere in the data archives, a small collective of alien artists discovered jazz. They did not understand it at first. The structure was loose, the rhythm unpredictable, and the melodies wandered in directions that no mathematical model could anticipate. One of the artists, a tall, willowy being with 6 arms, who sculpted sound waves into physical shapes, listened to a recording of a saxophone solo from a smoky club in New Orleans and sat perfectly still for an entire hour afterward. When asked what was wrong, the artist said, "Nothing is wrong. I have simply never heard anything so alive." But not everyone was fascinated. Some were afraid. The Drathari Dominion had been watching the situation from the moment the Tier 5 classification was announced. The Drathari were a proud, militaristic species, tall, armored, with sharp ridges along their skulls, and a culture built on discipline and control. They had earned their place in the Concord through strength, and they viewed the galaxy through a simple lens. Power was either controlled or it was dangerous. Humanity, by every measure they could find, was dangerous. Ambassador Korath of the Drathari stood before the Concord's Security Council and laid out his case with cold precision. He showed them Earth's war statistics, the sheer number of conflicts, the body counts, the weapons. He showed them footage from human history that made even the most hardened council members look away. And then he showed them the projections. His analysts had run behavioral models on the human species, using every piece of data available. And the results were consistent. Given access to faster-than-light technology, humans would expand aggressively. Within 3 generations, they would be competing with established Concord species for territory. Within 5 generations, they would be a dominant military power. "This is not a species that will sit quietly at the table," Korath said. "This is a species that will flip the table over and build a bigger one." He demanded that the Concord impose a quarantine on the Sol system. No contact, no trade, no technology exchange. Lock them in and let them burn themselves out, as his analysts predicted they eventually would. The proposal sent a chill through the council chambers. Back on Earth, Megan Price was dealing with her own storm. The initial wave of excitement over first contact had begun to fracture along familiar lines. Some nations wanted to embrace the Concord with open arms, sign treaties, share technology, join the galactic community as fast as possible. Others wanted nothing to do with it. Protests broke out in a dozen countries. Religious leaders gave sermons about the meaning of alien life. Politicians gave speeches about sovereignty and independence. Cable news ran 24-hour coverage that was equal parts wonder and terror. Megan held a press conference from the United Nations building. She stood at the podium and spoke plainly. "We do not yet know what the future holds," she said. "But I know this. We did not come this far as a species by hiding from what we do not understand. We came this far by facing it. A little." Danny Holt, meanwhile, had been given a quiet assignment. While the diplomats talked and the politicians argued, he was asked to assess the Concord fleet's military capabilities. The request came from people high enough in the chain of command that refusing was not really an option. Danny did not like it, but he understood it. Hope was good. Preparation was better. He spent 2 days studying every scan, every sensor reading, and every piece of data the observation teams had gathered about the Concord ships. What he found was strange. The technology was advanced, far beyond anything Earth could build, but the tactical doctrine behind it was oddly cautious. The Concord fought wars of containment. Their weapons were designed to disable, not destroy. Their fleet formations were defensive. Everything about their military philosophy was built around the idea of minimizing damage and controlling outcomes. Danny sat back and thought about that for a long time. He thought about the way humans fought. The fury, the creativity, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a single objective. He thought about Normandy, about Stalingrad, about the countless battles where victory had come not from superior technology, but from sheer, bloody-minded refusal to lose. The Concord had never fought anything like that. He was not sure they could. He kept that thought to himself. On the orbital station, Luke Beckett was doing his best to stay out of trouble. This lasted approximately 3 days. The incident was small in the grand scheme of things. Luke was walking through a corridor on the station when he turned a corner and nearly collided with a Concord security officer. A massive, 4-armed being covered in dense gray hide. The officer barked something in a language Luke did not understand. Luke, startled, raised his hands instinctively. The officer interpreted this as a threat posture and stepped forward, towering over the young Marine by a full 2 feet. For a moment, the corridor was very quiet. Luke looked up at the alien. The alien looked down at Luke. Neither moved. Then Luke lowered his hands slowly, took a breath, and spoke. "My fault," he said clearly. "I was not looking where I was going. I apologize." He paused, then added, "Can I buy you a drink? We have coffee. It is terrible, but it is hot." The security officer stared at him. In the officer's experience, smaller beings who were confronted by larger beings either submitted or fought. They did not apologize and then offer beverages. The concept did not fit into any behavioral model the officer had been trained on. The officer reported the incident to Commander Yura Sohn that evening. He described the humans' behavior in detail. The initial flash of aggression, the immediate de-escalation, the apology, and the bizarre offer of a hot drink. Yirasone listened carefully. She had been reading Earth's military history for days now, and she was beginning to form a theory about this species. Their greatest strength was not their weapons or their technology. It was their ability to adapt, to shift from war to peace, from fury to kindness, from destruction to creation, all within the span of a single heartbeat. She filed her own report that evening. In it she wrote a single recommendation: do not underestimate this species. They are more than the sum of their contradictions. 3 days later, the Drethari Dominion's quarantine proposal was formally submitted to the Grand Assembly. For the first time in over a century, the Assembly would be convened to decide the fate of a single world. Megan Price received the news in her small office on the orbital station. She read the message twice, set it down, and looked out the window at the Earth below. "Well," she said quietly, "I guess we are going to trial." Danny, who was standing in the doorway, crossed his arms. "Then we had better make a good case." Megan nodded. "We will. We always do." She did not sound afraid, and that, more than anything else, was what made Danny believe her. The Grand Assembly Station sat at the heart of the galaxy, like a city floating in a sea of stars. It was enormous. A structure the size of a small moon, built over thousands of years by hundreds of species working together. Its halls were wide enough to fit rivers. Its chambers were tall enough to hold clouds. It had been the seat of galactic civilization for longer than most species could remember. And it had not convened a full assembly in over a century. It convened now because of Earth. The human delegation traveled aboard Zorith Vel's flagship. Danny Holt, Katie Warren, Luke Beckett, and Megan Price sat together in a small observation lounge and watched the stars blur past the viewport as the ship moved faster than light. None of them spoke much. They were the first humans to leave their own solar system. The weight of that sat on all of them differently. Danny with quiet focus, Katie with restless curiosity, Luke with a nervous energy he could not quite hide, and Megan with the steady calm of someone who had already made peace with whatever was coming. When they arrived, the station filled the viewport like a second sky. Thousands of ships from hundreds of species were docked along its outer rings. Lights moved across its surface in patterns that looked almost like breathing. Luke pressed his face to the glass and whispered something under his breath that might have been a prayer or might have been a curse. It was hard to tell with Luke. They were escorted to the assembly chamber, a vast, circular hall that stretched so far in every direction that the far walls were lost in haze. The seats rose in tiers, filled with representatives of every shape, size, and color imaginable. Beings of crystal and light sat beside creatures of dense muscle and horn. Species that breathed methane wore sealed helmets next to species that did not need to breathe at all. The noise of 800 civilizations talking at once was like standing inside a thunderstorm. And then, when the human delegation entered, the noise stopped. Every eye, every sensor, every organ of perception in that enormous hall turned toward the 4 small figures walking across the chamber floor. Danny kept his eyes forward. Katie studied the architecture. Luke set his jaw and walked like a soldier. And Megan Price, former small-town lawyer from Ohio, walked with her back straight and her head high, as if she had been doing this her entire life. The session began with the Drethari. Ambassador Korath stepped to the central platform and presented his case with the precision of a blade. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The data spoke for itself. He showed the assembly a species that had fought over 10,000 wars in its recorded history. He showed them the trenches and the gas and the fire. He showed them the bombs that could erase cities, and he reminded the assembly that humans had used them. He showed them projections, clean, mathematical models that predicted humanity's expansion across the stars, with the relentless hunger of a species that had never known how to stop taking. Every simulation we have run reaches the same conclusion, Korath said. This species will not be a partner. It will be a competitor and then a conqueror. Quarantine is not a punishment, it is a precaution. The chamber murmured. Many heads nodded. Then it was Megan's turn. She stood on the central platform, a human woman, average height, average build, standing in front of 800 civilizations that were deciding whether her species would be welcomed or caged. She had no projections, she had no simulations. She had practiced her speech a dozen times on the journey here, and then, in the final hour before the session, she had thrown it away, and decided to speak from memory instead. She looked out at the assembly, and began. Everything the Drathari ambassador showed you is true, she said. We have fought wars. We have built terrible weapons. We have hurt each other in ways that I cannot defend, and will not try to. If you judge us only by the worst things we have done, then yes, you should be afraid of us. She paused. But that is not all we are. She told them about a man who walked into a hospital every day for 30 years to sit with dying strangers so they would not be alone. She told them about a village that rebuilt itself 7 times after 7 floods, because the people who lived there refused to leave the land their grandparents had loved. She told them about a teacher who spent her own money to buy books for children who had nothing, and about a soldier who carried a wounded enemy off a battlefield because the enemy was crying for his mother. We are not perfect, Megan said. We have never been perfect. But we have something that I do not think your simulations can measure. We have the ability to look at our own darkness, to see it clearly, and to choose, every single day, to reach for something better. We fail. We fail often, but we never stop reaching. She looked directly at Korath. You are afraid of what we might become. I understand that. But I am asking you to consider what we have already survived. No species that is only destruction could have made it this far. We are still here, because underneath all the violence and the noise, there is something in us that refuses to give up. On ourselves, on each other, on the idea that tomorrow can be better than today. She stepped back. That is all I have. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, a low sound began to build. Not applause, but something close to it. A vibration that moved through the hall like a wave. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement, respect. Korath stood to respond, but before he could speak, every light in the chamber turned red. An emergency signal cut through the assembly like a knife. The hall erupted into chaos as data feeds flooded every screen. Danny was on his feet instantly, reading the information as it scrolled past. His face went pale. A massive energy anomaly had been detected at the edge of Concord space. Long-range sensors identified it as a Herafield swarm, a semi-organic, self-replicating armada that had not been seen in over 1,000 years. The last time it had appeared, it had consumed 2 entire civilizations before the Concord managed to drive it back into the intergalactic void. It had taken a combined fleet of 300 ships and 9 years of war. The swarm had returned. It was heading directly toward a Concord colony world called Velith Prime, home to 40 million people. The Concord fleet scrambled, but the numbers were not good. The fleet's defensive doctrine was built on slow, careful containment, layers of defensive lines, controlled engagements, methodical advances. The simulations showed that by the time enough ships arrived to form a proper containment line, Velith Prime would already be overrun. The colony had hours, not days. The chamber was in chaos. Species were arguing, commanders were shouting, and nobody could agree on a course of action fast enough. Danny Holt stood up. He did not shout. He did not push his way to the platform. He simply walked to the tactical display at the edge of the chamber, studied it for 2 minutes, and then turned to face the room. I can save that colony, he said. The noise died. 800 species stared at him. Danny pointed at the display. Your containment doctrine will not work in time. You need speed, aggression, and deception. You need to hit the swarm before it reaches the planet, disrupt its coordination, and break it apart so your main fleet can finish it off. Korath stepped forward. And how do you propose to do that? Danny looked at him. The way humans have been winning fights since we were throwing rocks at each other. You go fast, you go hard, you go ugly, and you do not stop until the other side breaks. Korath stared at him. That is not a strategy. That is madness. Danny smiled, a thin, tired smile that did not reach his eyes. Where I come from, we call it Tuesday. He turned to Zorath Vel. Give me a ship, give me volunteers, and get your main fleet moving. I will buy you the time you need. Zorath Vel looked at Danny for a long moment. He looked at Megan. He looked at Katie, who was already pulling up communication frequencies. He looked at Luke, who had not said a word, but whose eyes were steady and clear and ready. Then the old ambassador did something he had not done in 400 years of careful, measured diplomacy. He made a decision on instinct. They gave Danny a frigate. It was a Concorde patrol vessel, fast, lightly armed, and never designed for what Danny had in mind. The Concorde engineers looked at his battle plan and told him politely that it would not work. Danny thanked them politely and told them to load every weapon the ship could carry and remove anything that was not essential. By the time his team was done, the frigate had been stripped to its bones. No luxury, no comfort, nothing but engines, weapons, and a communications array that Katie Warren had personally rewired to broadcast on frequencies the Harrowfield swarm used to coordinate. Luke Beckett stood in the docking bay and watched volunteers arrive. Most of them were human, Marines, pilots, and engineers who had been part of the orbital station crew back on Earth and had traveled with the delegation as support staff. They were not soldiers of the Concorde. They were not trained for alien warfare. But when Danny had asked for volunteers, every single one of them had stepped forward. Luke looked at their faces and saw the thing he had seen 100 times before in the eyes of people who knew the odds and had decided they did not care. He also saw something he did not expect. 3 Concorde officers had volunteered as well. One of them was the four-armed security officer Luke had nearly collided with on the station weeks ago. The officer approached Luke, looked down at him and said in broken English, "You offered me coffee. I did not take it. I owe you." Luke grinned. "Stick with me. I will get you that coffee after." Commander Yurasone took the bridge. She had not been ordered to join the mission. She had volunteered herself, walking onto the frigate with the easy confidence of someone who had already done the math and made peace with the answer. When Danny raised an eyebrow, she simply said, "I have been studying your species for weeks. I would like to see the theory in practice." Danny sat in the command chair and looked at his crew. A handful of humans and a few brave aliens, crammed into a borrowed ship, flying toward a swarm that had destroyed civilizations. He opened the ship-wide channel. "Listen up," he said. "I am not going to give you a speech about glory or duty. You know why you are here. The people on that colony world have 40 million reasons for us to get this right. And we are going to get this right. The plan is simple. We go in fast, we hit their coordination signal, and we break them apart long enough for the main fleet to arrive. It's going to be rough. It's going to be ugly. And some of us might not come back." He paused. "But we are going anyway, because that is what we do." He closed the channel. Yura-san looked at him from across the bridge. "Your species gives very short speeches before battle," she said. Danny shrugged. "Long speeches waste time. Besides, they already know." The frigate launched. They crossed the distance to Velith Prime in hours. The swarm was already visible on long-range scanners. A massive, shifting cloud of semi-organic ships that moved like a living thing. Millions of individual units connected by a single coordinating signal. The cloud was the size of a small planet, and it was closing on the colony world with a slow, terrible certainty. Danny studied the tactical display. The swarm's coordination signal was the key. Every unit in the swarm followed the signal like cells, following the instructions of a brain. Kill the brain, and the cells would scatter. Katie had identified the signal's frequency and built a disruptor, a crude, powerful device that would overload the frequency and scramble it. The problem was range. The disruptor needed to be activated inside the swarm's core to be effective. Inside the core. Luke had not hesitated when Danny explained the plan. He had simply nodded, checked his equipment, and started preparing his squad. Danny had looked at him for a long moment and said, "You know the odds." Luke had smiled. "I have been bad at math my whole life." The battle began at the edge of the swarm. Danny threw the frigate into the cloud at full speed, firing weapons in every direction. The tactic was not precise. It was not elegant. It was chaos. Deliberate, calculated chaos. The swarm reacted the way it always reacted, pulling units from the outer edges to deal with the threat. But Danny did not stay still long enough for them to swarm the ship. He darted and weaved, hitting clusters of swarm units, and then pulling away before they could converge. It was a fighting style that no species in the galaxy had ever used against a Harrowfield swarm, because no species in the galaxy fought like this. Yura-Son gripped her console and watched the human pilot throw the ship through maneuvers that her training told her were impossible. Twice, the frigate passed so close to swarm units that she could see the organic structures on their hulls through the viewport. Twice, Danny pulled away at the last possible second, leaving a trail of explosions behind them. "This is insane," she said. Danny, eyes locked on the display, said, "Thank you." In the middle of the chaos, Luke's squad launched. 3 small shuttles, barely more than armored pods, shot out of the frigate's belly and dove straight into the heart of the swarm. The pods were fast and small enough to slip through the gaps between swarm units. Inside the lead pod, Luke held the disruptor in his lap and watched the swarm close around them like a fist. The core was a nightmare. Swarm units pressed in from every direction, dense and dark and pulsing with the coordination signal. Luke's pilot, a young woman named Amber Cole, who had been flying cargo shuttles 6 months ago, threaded the pod through gaps that should not have existed. Her hands steady on the controls, her face blank with focus. They reached the center. Luke activated the disruptor. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the signal erupted from the device in a wave of electromagnetic force that rippled outward through the swarm like a shockwave through water. The coordination signal shattered. Across the entire swarm, millions of units lost their connection to each other simultaneously. The cloud, which had been moving with a single terrible purpose, broke apart. Units began spinning aimlessly, colliding with each other, drifting in random directions. The fist became dust. On the frigate's bridge, Danny watched the swarm fragment on his display. He opened a channel to the Concorde main fleet, which was still hours away. "The swarm's coordination is down," he said. "They are scattered and confused. You have your window. Do not waste it." The Concorde fleet arrived and did what the Concorde fleet did best: methodical, precise, overwhelming force applied to a disorganized enemy. What their projections had said would take weeks took 3 days. The swarm was broken, scattered, and driven back into the void. Velith Prime was saved. Luke's squad made it back to the frigate. 2 of the 3 pods were damaged. Several people were wounded. Luke himself had a deep cut across his forehead that he did not notice until Amber pointed it out. But they were alive. All of them. Against every projection, every simulation, and every model that the Concorde's best analysts had built, they were alive. Luke sat on the floor of the docking bay, bleeding and exhausted, and laughed. The 4-armed security officer sat down beside him. Luke looked up at him and said, "I still owe you that coffee." The officer made a sound that Luke chose to interpret as a laugh. The Grand Assembly reconvened 1 week later. The chamber was full again, but the mood was different. The fear was still there, but it was smaller now, and beside it stood something new. Korath, the Drathari ambassador, stood and formally withdrew his quarantine motion. He did not explain his reasons. He did not need to. The entire galaxy had watched the Battle of Velith Prime. They had seen what humans could do. Threndai stood before the assembly and spoke. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of that enormous hall, every word carried. "I have spent my life classifying species," he said. "I have placed them into categories and assigned them numbers, and believed that this told me who they were. I was wrong. This species cannot be classified. They are violent and gentle, reckless and careful, terrifying and kind. They convert their suffering into strength. They turn their chaos into creation, and they possess a stubbornness, a refusal to surrender, to quit, to accept that the odds are against them, that bends the shape of the universe itself." He paused. "I do not fully understand them. I am not sure anyone ever will. But I know this: I am glad they are here." The Concord voted. The result was unanimous. Earth was offered full membership, the fastest any species had ever been admitted in the history of the Galactic Concord. On the journey home, the frigate was quiet. Most of the crew slept. Danny sat alone in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars. Yura Sohn found him there and sat down beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Yura asked the question that had been sitting inside her since the first day she had opened Earth's archives. "How," she said, "how does a species survive what yours has survived?" Danny looked at the stars. He thought about the wars and the plagues and the bombs. He thought about the floods and the fires and the long dark centuries where it seemed like everything was going to end. He thought about the people who had stood up anyway. The doctors, the teachers, the soldiers, the mothers, the artists, the stubborn, foolish, beautiful people who had kept going when every reason to stop was staring them in the face. He smiled. "We just never learned how to quit," he said. Yura looked at him, then she looked at the stars, and for the first time in her life, she understood why this strange, broken, magnificent species had made it so far. 3 weeks later, a shuttle descended through the clouds over New York City. The doors opened, and Megan Price stepped onto solid ground. The sky above her was different now. It was the same blue it had always been, the same sun, the same wind on her face. But now it held something new. 100 new allies, a galaxy full of possibility, and the knowledge that humanity had earned its place among the stars, not by being perfect, but by being stubborn enough to keep trying. She looked up at that sky, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Far above, the stars shone on, quiet, patient, and no longer quite so empty.